In 1932, in a quiet government archive room in Washington, D.C., a junior records clerk named Daniel Mercer made a discovery that would quietly disturb him for the rest of his life. It started with dust. Old federal census boxes were being relocated from a flooded basement storage area to a newly renovated archival floor. The records were from 1890, a year already infamous among historians because most of its census records had supposedly been destroyed in a fire decades earlier. But these boxes were different. They weren't labeled correctly. Instead of the standard district markings, they were stamped with a single word in faded ink. Restricted. Daniel wasn't supposed to open them. They weren't on his transfer list. But curiosity has always been stronger than protocol. Inside were census sheets, handwritten, fragile, yellowed with time. At first glance, everything looked normal. Names. Ages. Occupations. Addresses. But then he noticed something strange. Every single person listed on these sheets had one thing in common. There were no birth records. No death records. No property records. No marriage licenses. No trace of them anywhere else in federal archives. According to every other official government record, these people had never existed. The town that vanished. The census pages referred to a small township in western Pennsylvania called Ashbourne Hollow. There was a population count of 312 residents. Men, women, children. Farmers. Teachers. Blacksmiths. Tailors. A mayor. A postmaster. Even a schoolteacher named Eleanor Whitfield who, according to the census entry, had been born in 1868 and lived on Riverbend Road. But here's the problem. There has never been a town called Ashbourne Hollow in Pennsylvania. Not on any historical map. Not in land registries. Not in railroad expansion documents. Not even in church archives. It was as if 312 people had been carefully written into existence. Only to be erased. Daniel should have reported it. Instead, he started digging. He cross-referenced the supposed district number with railroad routes from 1885 to 1895. Nothing. He searched shipping manifests. Nothing. He pulled up adjacent census districts to see if Ashbourne Hollow had been renamed. Nothing. And then he found something that truly unsettled him. On the final page of the census sheets, written in darker ink, almost as if added later, was a handwritten note. Enumeration verified. Community dissolved. No further documentation required. There was no signature. No official seal. No departmental stamp. Just that sentence. Community dissolved. Dissolved into what? A pattern across states. Daniel wasn't satisfied. He requested access to additional restricted census materials from neighboring states. Weeks later, more boxes arrived. And the pattern repeated. In rural Ohio, a township listed in 1870 census records with 147 residents, none of whom existed anywhere else in history. In northern Vermont, 94 residents of a logging settlement, again, zero trace beyond a single census year. In Missouri, a farming district of 201 people that appeared in one census. And disappeared in the next. No migration trails. No epidemic reports. No land redistribution filings. Nothing. It was as if entire communities had been quietly catalogued. And then removed from reality. The government silence. When Daniel discreetly approached his supervisor, he was told something strange. You're not authorized to pursue anomalies in restricted records. Anomalies. Not errors. Not mistakes. Anomalies. Within days, the boxes were removed from his desk. Transferred. No forwarding information. Daniel was reassigned to agricultural indexing. A quiet desk. No archives. No restricted access. But he had already copied names. Dozens of them. He began searching public libraries on weekends. And that's when the story became stranger. In a small historical society library in rural Ohio, Daniel found a privately donated diary from 1871. It belonged to a traveling preacher named Samuel Hargrove. One entry stopped him cold. Passed through a settlement not marked on any railway guide. Locals called it Briar's End. People wary. No church. No sheriff. No state presence. I was told politely to continue my journey. Briar's End. That was the name of the vanished Ohio township from the restricted census sheets. The diary described about 100 to 150 residents. Self-sufficient. Secretive. No outside officials allowed to stay overnight. Hargrove wrote that the townspeople insisted. We handle our own affairs. 3 months after that entry, Hargrove's diary abruptly ended. There were no more pages. No explanation. And no official record of Samuel Hargrove's death. The theory that shouldn't exist. By 1934, Daniel had formed a theory. What if these communities weren't accidents? What if they were intentional? What if the federal government had, at certain times in history, allowed, or even created, settlements outside official jurisdiction? Places where laws were flexible. Places that didn't technically exist. And if something went wrong, they could simply erase them. One census entry. One record. Then silence. It would explain why there were no land deeds. No court cases. No medical reports. No graves. Because if a town never officially existed, nothing inside it had to exist either. The warning letter. In March of 1935, Daniel received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single sentence typed on plain paper. Stop searching for people who were never meant to be found. No signature. No explanation. He told no one. But he stopped visiting libraries. Stopped requesting restricted files. He married. Had children. Retired quietly in 1962. And he kept one thing hidden in his attic. A leather folder containing copied names from the erased census sheets. In 1998, Daniel Mercer's granddaughter, Claire Mercer, inherited his home. While cleaning the attic, she found the folder. Inside were handwritten names. Township references. Notes in the margins. And that strange phrase. Community dissolved. Claire was a graduate student studying American historical documentation. She assumed it was a research project. Until she searched Ashbourne Hollow in digital archives. Nothing. She searched Briar's End. Nothing. She searched the 1890 census district referenced in Daniel's notes. Officially destroyed in fire. Except. One anomaly appeared in the digital system. A redacted record request from 1933. Filed by Daniel Mercer. Status, sealed. Reason, Administrative Security Directive 12. Claire had never heard of Directive 12. Because it doesn't officially exist. A map that shouldn't be there. While scanning the documents, Claire noticed something Daniel had drawn but never explained. A rough hand-sketched map. 3 red circles. Pennsylvania. Ohio. Vermont. All forming a triangular pattern. In the center of that triangle was nothing. No town marked. No reference. Just empty forest on historical maps. Except in Daniel's notes, beside the center point, he had written. Primary site. Primary site of what? Claire did what her grandfather never could. She got in her car. And drove to the center of the triangle. Deep in the Appalachian woods. To coordinates that, according to all official records, contain nothing at all. Claire Mercer had always believed history was solid. Recorded. Documented. Preserved. But as she drove deeper into the Appalachian Mountains, GPS signal fading and trees swallowing the road behind her, she began to understand something her grandfather had learned decades earlier. History can be edited. The coordinates Daniel Mercer had circled in red ink led to a stretch of forest officially labeled as protected land, uninhabited, undeveloped, and historically empty. But Claire had studied enough historical cartography to know that empty doesn't always mean untouched. It sometimes means erased. The road that shouldn't exist. About 3 miles from the marked coordinates, Claire noticed something unusual. A narrow gravel road branching off the highway. It wasn't labeled on Google Maps. It wasn't marked on her printed topographical chart. But it was there. Old. Weathered. With faded wooden posts that looked like they had once held a sign. She hesitated. Then turned onto it. The forest closed in quickly. Branches scratched the sides of her car. Gravel cracked under the tires. After 10 minutes, she saw something that made her stomach tighten. A rusted metal gate. Wide open. No lock. No warning signs. Just open. Beyond it, the gravel widened into what had once clearly been an access road. And that meant something had once been accessed. The foundation. After another half-mile, the trees began to thin. And then she saw it. Stone foundations. Rectangular outlines in the earth. Covered in moss and vines. But unmistakable. Structures had once stood here. Multiple buildings. Organized. Laid out like a small settlement. Claire stepped out of her car slowly. The air felt still. Too still. She walked to the largest foundation. About 30 feet wide. Possibly a meeting hall. Or schoolhouse. And that's when she noticed something carved into one of the surviving stones. A name. Barely visible beneath lichen. H. 1889. Ashbourne Hollow. Toward the center of the clearing stood a circular stone structure. A well. Half collapsed. She approached carefully and looked inside. Dry. At least 20 feet deep. But carved into the inner stone lining, repeated over and over, were initials. W.H. E.W. T.R. S.B. Claire froze. She recognized those initials. They matched names from her grandfather's copied census pages. William Harper. Eleanor Whitfield. Thomas Reed. Samuel Brooks. These weren't myths. These were people. And they had been here. The school bell. Near the edge of the clearing, half buried in leaves, Claire spotted a curved piece of rusted metal. She brushed away debris. It was a school bell. Cracked down the center. Attached to a broken wooden frame. The metal was stamped with a manufacturer's seal dated 1888. Official. Documented. Mass-produced. Which meant if this bell had been ordered, there should be purchase records. Shipping receipts. Railway delivery logs. Unless those, too, had been erased. The silence. Claire began taking photographs. Wide shots. Close-ups. Stone markings. The well. The foundations. She documented everything. Then something shifted. Not in sight. In sound. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds. No wind. No insects. She slowly turned. And for just a moment. She thought she saw movement between the trees. A shadow. Tall. Still. Watching. She blinked. It was gone. But the silence remained. The secondary sight. Claire returned to her car, heart racing, and opened her grandfather's map again. 3 red circles forming a triangle. This clearing was not exactly at the center. It was slightly north. Which meant there might be more. She drove further south into the woods using her phone's offline compass. No road now. Just rough terrain. Branches scraping. Rocks hitting the undercarriage. And then another clearing. Smaller. More overgrown. But different. Instead of foundations, she saw something else. Wooden posts. Arranged in rows. Like markers. Grave markers. But without names. No inscriptions. No dates. Just blank wood. Dozens of them. The burn pattern. At the far edge of the second clearing, the ground looked darker. Charred. Even after more than a century, the soil was blackened. Claire crouched and touched it. Ash. Fused into the dirt. Whatever had happened here had involved fire. And a lot of it. She remembered something from part 1 of her grandfather's notes. In 1890, most census records were officially destroyed in a federal warehouse fire. But what if that wasn't the only fire? The photograph. As the sun began to drop, Claire prepared to leave. But something metallic caught her eye near one of the wooden posts. She dug carefully. And pulled out a small rectangular object. A photograph. Miraculously preserved in a tin case. Black and white. Faded but visible. It showed about 20 people standing in front of what appeared to be the large foundation building she'd seen earlier. Men. Women. Children. Serious expressions. Formal clothing. But something about it was wrong. Everyone in the photograph cast a shadow. Except one figure. A man standing slightly apart from the group. Tall. Wearing a dark coat. No shadow. And as Claire leaned closer, she noticed something even stranger. The man's face wasn't blurred. It wasn't damaged. It wasn't faded. It was scratched out. Deliberately. Removed from the emulsion. As if someone had tried to erase him from the image itself. The return home. Claire drove back before nightfall. But the feeling of being watched followed her all the way to the highway. When she reached her apartment, she uploaded the photos to her computer. And that's when the final shock of the day hit. In every wide-angle photograph she had taken, there was a shape in the tree line. In the background. Standing in nearly the same position. Tall. Still. Watching. In every single shot. She hadn't seen him while taking the pictures. But the camera had. And in one image. Zoomed far in. You could almost make out the outline of a coat. And a hat. Very similar. To the silhouette drawn faintly in her grandfather's notebook margin. Beside the words. Primary observer. The call. At 11:42 p.m. that night, Claire's phone rang. Unknown number. She hesitated. Then answered. There was no greeting. No voice at first. Just breathing. Slow. Measured. Then a calm male voice said. You went somewhere you weren't supposed to. Claire's blood ran cold. Who is this? A pause. Then. The census was never about counting people. Click. The line went dead. Claire didn't sleep. Not after the phone call. Not after zooming into the photographs again and again. Not after realizing the shadow in the trees wasn't random. It was consistent. Same height. Same posture. Same distance from the camera. In every image. And that meant one thing. He wasn't moving through the forest. He was positioning himself. The phrase that didn't fit. The census was never about counting people. Those words replayed in her mind all night. If it wasn't about counting, then what was it about? Control? Surveillance? Relocation? Or something worse? Claire opened her grandfather's leather folder again. She scanned every handwritten note more carefully than before. That's when she saw it. A page she hadn't noticed. Folded twice. Hidden inside the back cover. At the top was written in bold pencil. Observer Protocol, Preliminary Notes. Her pulse quickened. The Observer. According to Daniel Mercer's handwriting, the restricted census files weren't ordinary population records. They were field reports. Each erased town had something in common. Remote location. Self-contained infrastructure. No external governance. Limited outside contact. Recorded for one census cycle only. And next to each community name, Daniel had written the same annotation. Observer assigned. Observer. Not mayor. Not sheriff. Not census taker. Observer. Claire flipped to the copied names list. Next to Ashbourne Hollow, one name had a faint circle around it. Not William Harper. Not Eleanor Whitfield. A different name. Marcus Hale. Age listed, 38. Occupation, Federal Enumerator. But when Claire searched National Enumerator records from 1890, there was no Marcus Hale. No appointment record. No payroll record. No birth certificate. No death certificate. He was listed only inside the erased census sheets. The observer himself did not officially exist. Claire spread the documents across her living room floor. Ashbourne Hollow, 312 residents. Briar's End, 147 residents. Vermont Logging Camp, 94 residents. Missouri Settlement, 201 residents. She began adding numbers. 312 plus 147 plus 94 plus 201 is equal to 754. Then she noticed something chilling. Each town disappeared within 18 months of being recorded. Every single one. And the census cycle after their listing always contained the same typed note. Community dissolved. Not abandoned. Not relocated. Not destroyed. Dissolved. As if they were never meant to solidify in the first place. The Federal Directive. Claire contacted a professor she trusted, Dr. Leonard Graves, a specialist in archival anomalies. She didn't tell him everything. Just enough to gauge his reaction. When she mentioned Administrative Security Directive 12, there was a long silence on the other end of the call. Claire, where did you hear that? My grandfather's sealed file. Another pause. That directive doesn't appear in any accessible federal documentation. It's referenced in declassified Cold War papers, but always redacted. Redacted how? As if it predates the Cold War entirely. He lowered his voice. There are rumors among archivists. About something called the Observer Program. Claire's heart stopped. What is it? No one knows officially. But the theory is this: in the late 1800s, the federal government experimented with isolated social communities. Closed systems. Experiments. Controlled environments. Self-governed. Observed. Studied. And then they were terminated. Terminated. Claire hung up and stared at the word written in her notes. Dissolved. Not terminated. Not destroyed. Dissolved. As if the community had been a chemical compound. Broken apart. What if the observer wasn't there to count people? What if he was there to measure them? Their behavior. Their obedience. Their resilience. And what if something in those communities had failed? Claire scanned the recovered photograph again at ultra-high resolution. She zoomed into the scratched-out face. Beneath the damage, faint outlines remained. She enhanced contrast. Adjusted shadows. And slowly, the shape of a jawline appeared. A high collar. A narrow mustache. Her breathing became shallow. Because she had seen that face before. Not in the forest. Not in the well carvings. But in her grandfather's attic box. There had been an old photograph tucked in the folder. Daniel Mercer standing in front of a government building in 1933. And behind him, half visible, standing near the doorway, a tall man in a dark coat. Same posture. Same build. Same narrow mustache. Marcus Hale. But that would be impossible. The Ashbourne Hollow census was dated 1890. If Marcus Hale had been 38 then, he would have been over 80 in 1933. Yet the man in the background looked no older than 40. The ageless pattern. Claire pulled open her laptop and began cross-referencing. She searched for unexplained figures in historical photography databases. Government archives. News articles. Census staff images. And she found something disturbing. In a 1911 flood relief photograph from Ohio, there he was. Standing behind a group of officials. Unaged. In a 1927 rail expansion ceremony photo, again. Unaged. In a 1943 factory inspection image, partially visible in the background. Unaged. Every time positioned slightly apart. Watching. Never interacting. Never acknowledged. The observer. The break-in. At 2:17 a.m., Claire heard glass shatter. Her living room window exploded inward. She screamed and dropped behind the couch. Footsteps. Heavy. Measured. She grabbed her phone, no signal. Her Wi-Fi had cut out. The footsteps stopped in the hallway. Silence. Then a voice. Calm. Controlled. You were not meant to find the secondary site. Claire's heart pounded so violently she thought she might pass out. Who are you? She shouted. A shadow crossed the doorway. Tall. Coat. Hat. We observe. We record. We preserve stability. What does that mean? It means some communities are variables. And variables must be corrected. She grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and hurled it toward the doorway. The bulb shattered. Darkness. By the time she crawled forward, the hallway was empty. Front door open. Cold night air rushing in. On her floor, lying among scattered papers, was a single sheet. Typed. Clean. Modern. Observer assignment updated. Subject, Claire Mercer. Status, active variable. The realization. Claire finally understood. The erased towns weren't the experiment. The people weren't the focus. The observer was. A constant. Across decades. Across generations. Monitoring anomalies. Correcting deviations. And now. She was one. The hidden line in Daniel's notes. Shaking, she flipped to the final page of her grandfather's writing. There was one sentence, written in frantic handwriting unlike the rest. The observer does not age. The observer does not disappear. The observer waits. And beneath it, a second line. Added later. In different ink. Not Daniel's handwriting. You noticed. Claire didn't call the police. What would she say? That an ageless federal enumerator from 1890 broke into her apartment? That erased towns were social experiments? That she had just been labeled an active variable? No. Whoever this was, whatever this was, operated beyond normal systems. And that meant she had to go deeper. The storage locker. Among her grandfather's belongings was a small brass key taped inside the leather folder. On the back of the key, Daniel had written, "Locker 27, if they escalate." Escalate. Claire drove to the old bus terminal storage facility listed on the faded rental receipt she found in Daniel's documents. The facility was nearly abandoned now, mostly in used metal lockers and broken fluorescent lights. Locker 27 was in the far corner. Her hands trembled as she inserted the key. Inside was a sealed metal case. Government issue. Stamped faintly. U.S. Department of Interior, Special Enumeration Division. She had never heard of such a division. Because it doesn't exist in any official archive. The film reels. Inside the case were old film reels. Labeled by location. Ashbourne Hollow, 1891. Briar's End, 1871. North Vermont Camp, 1884. Claire borrowed a vintage film scanner from the university lab that night. When she loaded the Ashbourne Hollow reel, the footage flickered to life in grainy black and white. It showed the town alive. Children running. Women hanging laundry. Men repairing tools. A normal community. And then the camera shifted. To a man standing on a hill overlooking the settlement. Dark coat. Hat. Watching. The observer. The footage timestamp showed date stamps across several months. And then. The final segment. The townspeople gathered in the central square. The observer standing in front of them. Speaking. No audio survived. But the body language was unmistakable. Tension. Fear. And then. Uniformed men entered the frame. Not soldiers. Not police. Unmarked. The film cut abruptly. The final frame burned white. Tucked beneath the film reels was a folder marked. Directive 12, Correction Protocol. Claire opened it slowly. The document was structured like a scientific study. Objective. To establish isolated civic environments for behavioral pattern observation. Phase 1, Community Development. Phase 2, Stability Monitoring. Phase 3, Deviation Assessment. Phase 4, Correction. Correction. Not relocation. Not closure. Correction. The details under Phase 4 were heavily blacked out. But one line remained visible. If deviation exceeds acceptable thresholds, community dissolution is required. Dissolution. The word again. But now it had a definition. Erasure. What was the deviation? Claire scanned the Ashbourne Hollow notes. Under Deviation Assessment, several checkboxes appeared. Leadership noncompliance. Refusal of external integration. Collective resistance behavior. Unauthorized external contact. Unauthorized contact. Samuel Hargrove, the traveling preacher from Ohio. He had passed through Briar's End. 3 months later, the town dissolved. Eleanor Whitfield, schoolteacher of Ashbourne Hollow. Her name had been underlined twice in Daniel's notes. Why? Claire flipped through the folder again. And found a smaller document. Subject, Whitfield, Eleanor. Status, Catalyst. Catalyst. The catalyst pattern. Claire reviewed the other town records. Each erased community had one individual marked catalyst. Someone who questioned authority. Someone who resisted observer influence. Someone who encouraged independent governance beyond monitored limits. When the catalyst spread dissent, the observer initiated correction. And the entire town paid the price, but that still left one impossible detail. Marcus Hale. Recorded in 1890. Seen in 1911. Photographed in 1927. Spotted in 1933. Captured faintly in Claire's own images in 1998. Unaged. Unchanged. Claire searched for one final possibility. Early federal biometric programs. Experimental longevity research. Government cloning. The 1990s. The Observer program hadn't ended. It had evolved. And at the very end of the timeline, there was a blank space. Labeled. Next site. The voice in the dark. A sound echoed behind her. Slow footsteps descending the ladder. Claire turned. Marcus Hale stood at the bottom rung. Unaged. Unchanged. Calm. You were not supposed to see Phase 4, he said. Claire's voice trembled but held. You erased them. We corrected instability. They were people. They were variables. Why are you still alive? A pause. Then the faintest hint of something in his expression. I am not alive. The lights flickered. And Claire realized. The Observer program was never about communities. It was about testing humanity's resistance to control. And Marcus Hale was not a man. He was the control. The underground chamber felt colder than the forest above it. Not the cold of air. The cold of calculation. Marcus Hale stood at the base of the ladder, his silhouette cutting through the dim emergency lighting like a fixed shadow. Claire forced herself not to step back. You're not alive, she repeated. Marcus tilted his head slightly. Alive is a biological condition. I am continuity. His voice wasn't mechanical. It wasn't distorted. It was calm. Neutral. Ageless. Just like him. The first observer. You were created, Claire said, her voice steadier now. By who? By necessity. That's not an answer. It is the only one that matters. Marcus stepped toward the wall of photographs. The timeline. The erased towns. The late 19th century introduced instability, he continued. Industrialization. Migration. Ideological fragmentation. The federal government required predictive modeling of isolated civic behavior. So you built fake towns. They were not fake. They were controlled. Controlled how? Population selection. Resource limitation. Leadership influence. Information restriction. Claire felt sick. You manipulated them. We observed. And when they resisted? We corrected. Marcus walked to a metal cabinet and removed a thin file. He handed it to her. Ashbourne Hollow, termination summary. The word made her chest tighten. Inside were charts. Behavioral fluctuation reports. Risk assessments. Under, Catalyst Activity, was Eleanor Whitfield's name. Eleanor had encouraged the town to reject federal grain contracts. She had questioned supply chain monitoring. She had suggested electing leadership without observer approval. Deviation had risen to 62%. Threshold for correction, 60%. So you burned them? Claire whispered. Marcus's expression did not change. Fire was efficient. It wasn't just destruction, Marcus said. It was erasure. After each correction, federal documentation systems were adjusted. Birth certificates voided. Land titles nullified. Census copies destroyed. Adjacent district boundaries redrawn. Maps revised. Records sealed under Directive 12. If history holds no record, Marcus said quietly, instability cannot spread. Claire's hands trembled as she closed the file. You erased 754 people. Marcus corrected her without emotion. Documented total across 4 early sites, 1,932. Her breath caught. There were more. There were always more. The evolution. Claire turned to the extended timeline on the wall. It stretched far past the 1890s. Why continue, she demanded. Why not stop? Because instability adapts. The observer program had evolved. By the mid-20th century, entire towns were no longer necessary. Smaller environments sufficed. Research facilities. Remote housing projects. Closed military communities. Even suburban neighborhoods. The model refined, Marcus explained. The variable pool decreased. And now? Now we test digitally. Claire froze. Digitally. You don't need isolated towns anymore, she realized. You isolate minds. Silence. Which was confirmation. Claire's role. You labeled me active variable. Why? Marcus looked at her with something almost like curiosity. You located primary observation chamber without directive guidance. So. You are fourth-generation exposure. Her heart skipped. My grandfather. Daniel Mercer deviated from assigned archival scope. You watched him too. Observation is perpetual. Claire's mind raced. The observer program didn't just erase communities. It monitored lineage. Anyone who uncovered fragments of the truth became a variable. And variables required correction. Suddenly, the chamber lights flickered violently. Marcus paused. For the first time, something shifted in his expression. The faintest tension. On the control desk, old screens crackled with static. Claire looked around. What's happening? Marcus turned slowly toward the equipment. System instability. She realized something critical. The chamber was ancient. Analog. Decaying. Whatever sustained Marcus, whatever sustained the observer program, depended on infrastructure. And infrastructure degrades. You're not continuity, she whispered. You're maintenance. The core. Claire moved toward the back of the chamber. Behind the timeline wall was a narrow door slightly ajar. Inside was a cylindrical structure. Metal. Wired into the chamber grid. A core unit. Not biological. Not human. Marcus's voice sharpened slightly. Do not approach. That was the first command he had given. Not a statement. A command. Claire stepped closer. You said you're not alive. I am the observer. You're hardware. Silence. The lights flickered again, harder this time. She understood now. Marcus Hale wasn't immortal. He was projected. Maintained. Updated. Transferred. An entity designation, M.H-01. The first in a line of operational observers. And the core unit sustained him. You can't erase the digital age, Claire said quietly. You can't burn the internet. Marcus stepped toward her. Correction protocol will initiate. And how many people will you erase this time? She shouted. He didn't answer. Which meant the number would be large. Claire grabbed a loose cable from the control panel and slammed it into the core unit. Sparks erupted. The chamber trembled. Marcus froze mid-step. His form flickered, subtly, like interference on old film. You destabilize continuity, he said, voice fragmenting. Good. She yanked another cable. The screens shattered into static. The lights burst. And the core began emitting a high, piercing tone. Marcus's outline glitched, for the first time losing sharpness. You are creating instability, he said. That's the point. The tone intensified. Cracks spread across the core's metal casing. Marcus reached for her, but his hand faltered halfway. Like an image losing resolution. You misunderstand, he said, voice now distorted. Instability does not disappear. It multiplies. Then let it, Claire answered. The core ruptured. Light flooded the chamber. And Marcus Hale dissolved. Not into ash. Not into smoke. Into absence. Like a scratched face in an old photograph. Gone. Aftermath. When Claire climbed back to the surface, dawn was breaking. The forest was loud again. Birds. Wind. Life. She turned to look at the clearing. The wooden markers were still there. But something felt different. Lighter. As if the weight of observation had lifted. The upload. Back home, Claire digitized everything. The film reels. The Directive 12 files. The chamber photographs. She didn't send them to one newsroom. She released them everywhere. Academic forums. Historical databases. Public archives. Encrypted networks. Mirrored servers. You can't erase everything when it's everywhere. Within days, online communities began noticing inconsistencies in historical records. Maps were re-examined. Old photos reanalyzed. Names resurfaced. William Harper. Eleanor Whitfield. Thomas Reed. Samuel Brooks. They existed. Because now they were remembered. The final entry. Weeks later, Claire returned to her grandfather's final notebook page. The line beneath, "The observer waits." You noticed. She realized something. That second line had not been written by Marcus. It had been written by Daniel Mercer. He had noticed too. He had simply lacked the tools to act. Claire closed the book. Outside her apartment window, the city buzzed with noise and unpredictability. Uncontrolled. Unmonitored. Unstable. Human. Years later, historians would debate whether the observer program was real. Some would call it fabrication. Others conspiracy. But archived digital fragments would persist. And one thing would never again be possible.